Chapter 1. Ember Weather. The smoke in Ashdown didn't climb. It settled. It lay along gutters and stone sills like a tired cat, not rising even when chimneys offered it a straight shot into the clear. Iris Vale watched it from the lay-by at the top of the hill, hands still on the wheel though the engine had stopped. The valley wore a lid of dull glass, an inversion, the weatherman would have said. Lita called it ember weather, when the old things remembered what they were. She drove down anyway. You don't circle a town forever, because the air has developed ideas. The lane narrowed, hedges furred with last berries, and Ashdown collected her without flourish. Red brick, slate roofs, the river's dark strip, the green with its squat memorial where the gallows once stood, and the town pretends it never quite did. A saucer sat upside down on Aunt Lita's step, holding a folded note safe from dew. Ashdown manners. The paper wore Lita's blocky hand, each letter carefully separated like she had trusted her pen to misbehave if sentences were allowed to run. Little bird, it read, when you come, leave the flue open and the kettle on low. Don't polish the irons. Don't wipe the soot cross from the lintel. If the smoke asks a question, breathe through your nose and keep your mouth shut. The doors will remember what to do. The date above the greeting was last week. Lita had been dead 3 days. A key under the geranium pot, of course. The cottage door gave its long-taut sigh. The hallway smelled of lemon oil and old coal. Above the kitchen threshold, the soot cross showed as if it had grown there with the plaster. A straight vertical smudge and a shorter crossbar. Iris reached, then didn't, then did, touching it with the back of one finger the way you test tepid bathwater. The soot took her print without fuss. She felt foolish and steadied herself by making tea. The kettle on low felt performative, blue flame barely licking the metal. But Lita had asked for it, and the living obey the dead for a time if the dead were good company. Iris found the bell in the drawer where Lita had always kept string, knucklebones, a packet of dressmaker's pins. Small, brass, clapperless. She hung it under the front lintel where it would not ring and could not. Where, according to every aunt who had ever minded a door in this town, it would help the threshold remember its job. There was the funeral at 2. White curtains, modern furnace, a small professional sigh, as the machine decided to be thorough. The smell of creosote on everyone's hair in the cold outside. People pressed plates into Iris's hands afterward, bread, cold sausage, something that might once have been trifle. Magda Pruitt, who had trimmed Lita's hedges unasked for 4 decades, kissed Iris's cheek and said, "You'll sleep at the cottage," as if sleep were a thing a person could select off a menu. She pressed a red thread into Iris's palm, coarse wool, tied at both ends. "Wrist to cuff," she said. "You need reminding? Tie your remembering to your sleeve." They asked whether Iris would stay. She said she would sort Lita's papers and house, and then decide. The true answer, that she had nowhere else to be quick, not now, not nicely, stay behind her teeth. Ashdown has ears. The first night in the cottage tried to be ordinary. Iris opened the flue, banked the little stove the way Lita had taught her, coal forward, ash settled low, bent a hair, and left the kettle murmuring. She looked through the top drawer of the sideboard for a will and found, instead, an envelope addressed to anyone who has to clean up after me. Inside, a single sheet with 9 names. Rowan. In the gray half-hour before morning tips, she dreamed that the smoke on the green took on shoulders and a tilt of head the way fogs sometimes pretend to do when you're primed for ghosts. In the dream, the figure lifted its arm and pointed at her cottage. In the dream, she said, as if correcting a child in class, "No, waking." She found a faint crescent on the mat outside the front step, a soot print the size of a bare heel. She swept it into a jar and wrote on a label with Lita's felt tip, "Soot, front step, first night." Mid-morning, when the inversion bit, the whole valley tasted faintly of burned sugar. Ember weather had set, and with it the kind of remembering that makes a town chattier. Pearl Hollis at the records desk pressed Iris's hand and said, "I'm sorry," in a way that felt like a break in the day rather than a public performance. Deputy Kellum read past with a clipboard and did not stop because grief is not legislation. He put a small brass bell on the corner of the desk and went on, as if a little bit of wrong furniture in an office might help. Ashdown returned Iris to itself the way it returns everyone who is left. She went back to the cottage through High Street, counted 3 lintels with soot crosses, 2 with bells, and 1, an Airbnb, clearly, with a wreath of eucalyptus and apology. Outside the bakery, Ivy Tamsin wiped steam from her window with the heel of her hand and frowned at her own reflection. "See you tonight, Miss Vale," she called, not to be sweet, to say, "We're all watching our doors. You might as well be in company while we do." That evening, Iris left the flue open and the kettle murmuring again. When the knock came, 1 long, 1 short, 2, it found her waiting in the hall with her mouth shut and her patience on a leash. The soot cross did not move, but for the first time the air did. A press, a slight cold at her lips, attesting. She breathed through her nose and smiled like a woman who has decided she prefers honey to arguments. The press withdrew. The house remembered itself. All that night, the valley held smoke the way a palm holds water. The green wore a low scarf. Iris lay and listened for questions. She thought she heard one once in the pipe above the stove. She did not answer. By morning, she had Lita's list memorized without meaning to. Chapter 2. The Doors Will Remember. Ashdown Town Hall used to be a tannery, then a school, then a place the council stored folding tables. Now it held the archive in the old coat room and a vending machine that refused to stock anything with chocolate. Pearl had dragged out 3 gray boxes for Iris by the time she arrived, threaded with red twine like a warning. "What are you looking to prove?" Pearl asked, pen behind her ear. "That Lita kept better records than anyone else in this town," Iris said. "That's easy," Pearl said. "But if you wanted permission to believe the other thing, you have it." She tapped the nearest box. "Ashbourne Ledger. Families in common. We all live with one another's surnames like hand-me-down sweaters," she said. "You're a Vale on your mother, a PRYNN by your grandmother, and a nuisance by your aunt if you ever took sugar without asking. Magda says once a decade the smoke remembers who paid for the walls." The ledger had the kind of careful script that makes you want to apologize for your handwriting. Iris turned pages until she found Marjorie Vale, burned 1694, then a second line in another ink later. Marjorie's flour mixed into mortar 1701 Town Hall. Ash scattered on green. Bricks from kiln fired hotter. Good eggs. Lita had underlined good eggs like it was a joke worth saving. Below, rules when the weather lowers in Lita's hand. Flue open on ember nights. Bell hung without clapper under lintel. Bread on sill for guests, not for smoke. No names at the threshold. If it knocks, nose only. If it asks prettier, say cinder, soot, flew back to it. Children's names kept for day. What if it asks, please? Iris said aloud, and hated that part of her wanted to answer nicely. Then you feed it milk steam, Pearl said from her swivel chair, not looking up. And you do not teach it to say, Iris. Reports had started to gather on Pearl's desk without anyone calling them that. A text from the laundromat girl, steam on the inside of a dryer door, a mouth shape that couldn't hold. A note from Mr. Pruitt, the school caretaker. Boiler taking a long breath at 2 a.m, kids sleeping badly the night after. A voicemail from someone who didn't leave a name. It's writing on my window, in fog. I wiped it. It came back with an extra letter. I'm sorry for calling.
I'm embarrassed.
Don't be. Pearl had texted back. Bring me the towel you wiped the fog with. Ashdown sometimes does excellent science by accident. When Iris stepped onto the green, the smoke had pulled itself low, shoulder height. She could taste it, burned sugar and a sear like iron left in rain. Old ladies on benches had their scarves up. Men in vans drove with windows cracked as if the air in the cab could be trained. The memorial stood as always, bronze women who looked like saints instead of people who had once scolded sons for treading soot through kitchens. On the plinth, a tray of offerings, apples, bread crusts, a spool of thread.
No candle.
Too risky on ember days. Miss Vale, said a small voice at her elbow. June Park, serious as water, with a notebook and a pencil the size of a wand. Deputy Reed says I should tell you what the boiler did last night. You can tell me, Iris said, and crouched because she remembered how angry she had been whenever adults turned truths into lectures above her head. It breathed in. It said, J, and then something hissed. He looked at his shoes. I said, I am boy. It didn't like that. It breathed out and said, help. Then Mr. Pruitt whacked the side and told it to be decent in front of children. What did you do? Went home and put my bell under the bed.
He winced.
Is that silly? It's one of the least silly things I've heard this week, Iris said. A sound like laughter carried across the green, then crackling wrong. Ivy Tamsin stood in the bakery doorway, wiping her window again and scowling at the damp. It keeps writing the letter H, she said when Iris reached her. Steam on glass. I wipe. I come back with a tray, and there it is again. Not all the way to a name, just the H.
Ash.
Iris repeated gently. H for hot. Ivy said, too quickly. H for half-price buns at 3. I am not in the habit of taking messages from water. Hang your bell, Iris said. It's in the drawer, Ivy said. Put it under your lintel. With no clapper, Ivy said, making a face. It doesn't matter if it can ring. It matters if the door remembers it has a job. Iris said, and Ivy, who valued jobs being done, fetched the bell and hung it without further argument. The laundromat stank of lemon and warm metal. Hollis's girl, Cass, had her hair up in a rag and both hands in the machine door as if she might wrestle steam. It wrote L, she said, defensive before anyone accused. Which could be anything, right? Elevenses. Electric bill.
El Vale.
She blew a wet curl out of her eye. I unplugged the dryer in case it wanted to go to college. Give me the towel, Iris said. Cass produced a damp wad. Honestly, it looked like a towel that had wiped a window. But when Iris held it to her nose, the smell came up pure and unexpected. Creosote and burn apple. A chimney smell, not a dryer's. She put the towel in a plastic bag and wrote on the outside with Pearl's pen, Cass, dryer, L. The bag felt like a rational act. Iris held on to that feeling as long as she could. By late afternoon, Deputy Reed had called a meeting in the Brickworks Museum. They billed it as an ember weather safety update. It was a good euphemism. The small room held more people than chairs. The big kiln in the corner gave off permanent warmth, though it had been cold for 40 years. Reed stood with his clipboard and a look that asked for patience, and offered it back. We're not saying the town is haunted, he said, and paused long enough to let people smile. We are saying the air behaves a certain way when it's held low. In those conditions, we do certain things. We keep flues cracked. We hang bells. We don't sing names to babies by firelight. We don't say names at thresholds. We breathe through our noses if we hear knocking. If something tries a pretty, we give it soot, cinder, flue. If you see writing on glass, you wipe it with milk, not your sleeve. Milk, someone scoffed. Fat binds smoke, Magda called from the back. That's chemistry. The rest is manners. Dr. Harrow from the college, who had never successfully looked less like a professor than a professor deciding to look like a man in a sweatshirt, raised a hand. We're logging temps and pressure. There's a consistent 2 o'clock downdraft. Your grandmothers would call it the hour. I will, for once, concede that your grandmothers may be correct. What about the green? Ivy asked, arms folded. It's thicker there. Because that's where we spread the ashes, Reed said, ordinary as a calendar. We made the green into a sieve and then used it for picnics. We can't undo it now. We can only treat it like a neighbor who drinks too fast at weddings.
We could dig, someone said.
The room made a noise like a hand put over a pot's mouth to stop it boiling over. No, Reed said. We do not dig. He held up a bell. We remember. Back at the cottage, Iris did the remembering. Flue open. Kettle murmuring. Milk in a pan to steam, set under the vent in the kitchen to feed the chimney the appetite it ought to have. She lit the candle on the kitchen table, not for romance, for light, and practiced with the snuffer Lita kept, lowering the bell and taking the flame without letting smoke get excited about the new conversation. Each time the candle died, a whisper of air tried to say something and failed. At 1 in the morning, the knock came. One long, one short.
2.
The bell under the lintel did its remembered nothing. Iris stood in the hallway, quiet as a good secret. The air pressed at her lips. Kindly at first, then with the insistence a shop door has when the wind gets its leverage wrong. She breathed through her nose, slow, thinking. Chair.
Stove. Bell. Ledak.
The press withdrew. The stovepipe made a sound then, small and awful, an intake of a throat that has decided to try a word.
Ma, it said.
Not clearly, not even quite out loud. The shape in the air tried to write a letter on the cold glass of the window, M, and bungled it when Iris lifted the snuffer. She took the candle again. The little exhale the flame makes when it dies snapped the word and left it as nothing but air. In the morning there were 2 crescent prints on the mat, heel and ball, as if a barefoot had stood there and rocked once, impatient. She swept them into the jar with the first and wrote on the label, 2. Impatient. Then she took Lita's red thread and tied it wrist to cuff and to the kitchen chair and brewed coffee she didn't drink and tried to plan who to ask for help whom she wouldn't mind owing later. She chose Magda because Magda took debts the way women who'd never had school accounts learned to take them, lightly and forever. Magda came at 9 with ginger biscuits and a look at the soot cross the way a nurse looks at a wound that is doing as well as can be expected. It'll try to say Marjorie, she said, straightening the bell cord, because that's the Vale it knows best. It'll start with March. It'll leave you a letter or 2 on glass like a child practicing. You don't praise. You don't scold. You say the flu words and you sneeze. You keep your mouth. I can do that, Iris said. It'll walk the green at 2, Magda added, almost as an afterthought. Those of us with old names ought not to be there then. Because of the ashes, Iris said. Because of the habit, Magda said, and patted Iris's hand the way women pat the hands of other women when they don't want to say darling, but they feel it anyway. They stood together at the door and watched the smoke along the street, not rising, learning the corners. The bell under the lintel did nothing perfectly, and Iris found that she loved it for that. By noon, a boy had seen a face in the school boiler door and run. By 2, the green wore its scarf, and the bronze women did not look like saints at all. They looked like women who had lived with smoke and doors and names and knew the difference. By 4, Ivy texted Iris a picture of her bakery window with the letter H sweating faintly on glass. By 8, June had his bell under his bed and a plan to tell his grandmother at breakfast. By midnight, the knock came again. The smoke had learned to ask questions. Ashdown had begun answering them on purpose. Chapter 3. The Green Hour. By noon, the valley's air had thickened to the consistency of thoughts you don't say aloud. Smoke lay at knee-height along High Street and pooled at the green, making children's shins vanish as they chased each other round the memorial. Iris took the long way to the archive on purpose. Just a note, lintels. 3 more bells hung since yesterday. 2 soot crosses freshened with a finger. 1 flue cap wedged open with a spoon, as if cutlery could negotiate with weather. Pearl looked up from her desk with municipal relief.
Your boy was here, she said. June.
He brought me a drawing of the boiler's breath. I told him scientists begin with pictures, not numbers, and I stand by it. Iris smiled because love of a child will use any door. I need the catch file, she said softly, and Pearl, who hated to be predictable, had already set it out. The ledger sheets were a patchwork, baptisms, allotment assessments, brickworks pay stubs. Tucked into the back was a single page in Lita's late, patient hand. Catch hatches, under it, a list of Octobers every decade or so when soot had behaved like a door that wanted a hand on it. 1916, 1937, 1956, 1972, 1991. The annotations were domestic, not dramatic. L's with cough sleeps better if flew open. Nan tied red thread to bootlace, stopped saying names to stove. Boy wrote Ma, on window with breath, wiped with milk, did not come back. Under the list, no event remembers itself without help. The green helps. The brickworks helps. The school boiler enjoys company. Outside, a siren gave up before committing to urgency. Ember weather rarely drew ambulances. It drew watchers. Iris pushed through the town hall's double doors, and the day went thick across her cheeks. The green lay gray and deliberate. The bronze women's faces glossed with damp, as if they'd just told a long story and would not repeat it for the paper. She wouldn't have gone near it, too. Not if Lita were alive to scold. Not if Magda had sent a plate and a command instead of a text. But it was 1:48, and Elsie Ketch was already there, braids severe, jaw set to let nothing in. She stood at the edge of the memorial as if she had been posted there, a watchman without pay. "You shouldn't," Iris said, too close to teacher to be liked for it. Then, because the girl could not be easily moved by virtue alone, she added the currency teenagers accept. A reason. Because Ember Weather remembers your name better than you do. Elsie didn't look away from the bronze. "It knows all our names, Miss Vale. It has them on a list." She had her hands thrust into the pockets of her jacket the way you keep them when you mean to keep your mouth as well. "My gran says the smoke is like a neighbor who drank somebody else's grief and didn't digest it right." "That's clever," Iris said, and meant it. "Walk me to the bakery, then." Ivy's pretending not to be frightened. It would do her good to see a girl who isn't pretending as hard. Elsie's jaw worked, not agreeing so much as refusing to be contrary for sport. They went together across the grass. The smoke made circles at their ankles, crisping the hem of Iris's trousers with a smell like burned apple. Every 10 steps, Elsie's breath hitched, and Iris willed herself not to say, "Are you all right?" like a person who thinks sympathy earns interest. At the bakery, Ivy had the bell under her lintel and the letter H sweating on the glass, even though she'd wiped it while Iris was still inside the town hall. "See," she said triumphantly, offended. "This wants to be a sentence, and I won't be used for grammar." "Milk," Iris said, and Ivy fetched it with the affronted speed of experts asked to do something simple. Iris dipped the corner of a clean tea towel and dabbed the H. The milk left a soft crescent. When she wiped again, the letter came up easy, like a sulk that had been fed. Ivy's shoulders dropped half an inch. A shadow went by then, not heavy enough to be an event, not careless enough to be a passerby. Deputy Reed, clipboard tucked under his arm, hands in his jacket as if to prove he wasn't theatrical, walked the greens path with the gait of a man measuring how the ground feels under a bad sky. He nodded to them and did not approach. Thresholds were in use. They would not be muddled. At 2:03, the green breathed. It was obvious the way a cough is obvious. Every bell under every nearby lintel tilted, still silent, clapperless, like heads turning for the same rumor. Iris felt the air at her lips, not asking, testing. She shut her mouth and remembered Magda's list. Soot, cinder, flue. She breathed flue through her nose like a woman praying backward. From across the green came the small collapsed sound of something trying to be a word and failing. Reed did not stop his measured walk. He only slowed and then, with absurd, excellent mundanity, sneezed. The green let him keep his dignity. It pressed at the bakery door instead, flat as a hand. Ivy had both palms on the counter as if countertops deserved to be defended. "It wants the H," she muttered. "H for Helena, maybe." She glanced sideways at Elsie. Elsie's mouth flickered, annoyance and fear finding each other like cousins at a funeral. "Helena Wright lives by the allotments," she said. "She has the old stove. She's Great Granny Ketch's friend." Her braid looked too tight for the day, all of a sudden, as if it would snap her thoughts into tidy lengths if she allowed it. "I'll go." Iris shook her head. "We'll go, and we'll knock with our noses." They found Helena Wright wrapped in a cardigan so old it had decided to be a second skin. Her front step wore grit the color of pearl, the kind in the town hall mortar. A bell hung under her lintel, heavy, iron, clapperless. When she opened the door, the air trying to press from her hallway to the world went sulky at being exposed. "Don't say it," Helena said without preface. Her voice had the sweetness of a woman who has spent her life pleasing others on purpose and was, at last, too old to continue the performance. "I heard it say hell through the stove this morning like tea being poured too slow." Elsie slipped inside ahead of them like an apprentice, which instructed to manage the practicalities. She set a pan of milk on the hob and cracked the flue. Iris hung another bell at the back door, because the back door had the same pride every back door gets when the front thinks it's the only one that matters. They sat. Helena pulled a blanket over her lap, as if hospitality required her to become furniture. In 56, she said to the kettle. It wrote L on our window every night for a week. My mother wiped it with beer, said you don't waste milk on weather, and it only got worse. Then Nan Pruitt came and blew her nose on both sleeves and sang the flu words to the fire, and it stopped being clever. After that, it was all drafts and a mouse in the bread tin, which was preferable. Elsie's eyes flicked up at that. History with mice carried weight with girls who had been taught to be saintly about crumbs. Why us? She asked, not as a plea, as an audit. Helena smoothed the blanket, as if it might answer. Because our mothers paid for these walls with ash, she said, simple. Because what you put into mortar has a right to ask how you are, even if it asks stupid. The stovepipe took a breath. The milk steamed. The bell under the lintel did its exquisite nothing. Iris had the ridiculous impression of a very old woman being allowed to speak into the room, but reminded that she was not the only voice. The smoke gathered in neat curtains and ungathered. So, Helena said, and grinned at the stove, a grin wicked as cake. We will not be polite tonight. We will sit with our mouths shut and think things at you, and you will not get to borrow any of them. You may have cinder and soot and flue. You may not have Helena, unless I'm telling the baker I owe her for yesterday's buns. Elsie snorted, which is halfway to respect. The stove breathed again, trying the milk steam rose, bound it politely, fed the pipe the flavor of fat. Helena nodded, satisfied. That's right, she told the stove. Eat your supper. By the time they left, the light had dropped into that blue that makes sheep look clean and mistakes look inevitable. At the gate, Helena put her hand on Iris's sleeve. You'll have to walk the green once, she said. Not today. Not at 2. But once. With Magda. Else it will keep pointing. What if I don't? It will learn your mouth from the glass and make you use it when you're cold and tired and lonely, Helena said, and her voice was not unkind. Best not to be all three at once then. On their way back, they passed Reed at the corner of the allotments in conversation with nobody, or with the day. The Knox learned a third pattern, he said without being asked. Long, long, short. He lifted his eyebrows like a man who finds puzzles therapeutic and is ashamed of that fact. Don't answer it with your name, Iris said. Wasn't planning to, he said, and sneezed again, dutiful and reassuring. They parted at the bakery. The H had not returned to the window. Ivy wiped the damp for the pleasure of it rather than fear. On Leda Street, the soot lay thinner, as if the doorways had managed to convince the air to keep on walking. Iris stood at her own threshold and waited, mouth shut. The bell behaved beautifully. The soot cross-held. The knock did not come. She slept a little, then woke at the hour foxes argue with bins, and wrote in Leda's ledger by lamp. H. Helena, on glass 3 times, milk removes. Milk sent in towel equals chimney, not dryer. Girls learn refusal. Deputy learns to sneeze on cue. The green behaves like a neighbor unwilling to go home. When she put down the pen, the kettle ticked, 3 ticks, then 2, and she allowed herself to reply in the smallest of voices, through her nose, not her mouth. Later, the house did not object. Chapter 4. Names That Knock. The next morning dawned flat and woolly, an old sweater pulled up over Ashdown's ears. Iris tied the red thread Magda had given her around her wrist and threw the button at her cuff, and then, remembering Helena's tone, looped it loosely to the chair so her body would have to ask permission from her hands if it decided to leap at the door. Magda arrived with ginger biscuits in a tin and a coil of the same coarse thread. She tied Iris properly, as if fastening a girl into a skating boot, and set her own wrist to the lintel bell's cord so the bell's silence and Magda's pulse held the same line.
We'll sit, she said.
Will not be drawn. It will go collect its other invitations. What do you mean? Iris asked, because questions are the good manners of the frightened. It's courting, Magda said dryly. Smoke's a flirt. It's writing H on glass and M on yours and J on the boiler when it thinks no one is listening. We'll not call back. We'll let it get bored. She smiled, small and fierce. If it gets disruptive, we'll feed it fat. They sat. Ember weather wants witnesses more than victims. The kettle breathed like a good sleeper. The soot cross made no new decisions. Iris let the quiet work until it did the opposite of what quiet often does, calmed rather than accused. The knock didn't come. Through the window, a curious daylight. Clear above, wool at knee height. A dog passed in a cloud of shinless motion. Its lead ran into smoke like a measurement. At 10, Pearl texted a picture. The laundry's dryer door with the letters EL written soft and beaded with milk. Under the picture, Cass complied. Smell like hearth, not lint. Then a second text. School boiler. Mr. Pruitt says it tried, Ma, at 2:07. He hid the casing gently and told it not to. Iris pictured the caretaker's gentle violence. How men who've learned to move heavy things talk to objects, so small you might mistake the speech for prayer. At noon, Elsie Ketch appeared in the doorway with her braids slightly looser than yesterday and a face she had not brought to school before. That particular alchemy of adolescent pride and correctly placed fear. It followed me from the green, she said, defiant and ashamed in one breath. What did? Magda asked, not stupid. The air. Elsie snapped, then softened. It pressed at my lips, like it wanted to see whether my mouth had a catch on it or whether it was one of those easy drawers. You shut it, Magda said. You remembered your nose. Elsie nodded, a tiny, private yes. It didn't like that. It wrote L on Mrs. Dacey's window when I passed. That's manners, Magda said. It can't stand not being seen. It begs in letters. She patted the chair.
Seat. Tvet.
They tied Elsie, wrist to cuff, the way a town ties a girl to her sense until she grows a sense that can be trusted alone. Iris poured milk in a saucer and set it under the flue.
For the chimney, she said.
Not for the smoke.
Knock.
Not on wood. On the air. One long. One short.
2.
Then, after the smallest pause, the new pattern. Long, long, short. Magda closed her eyes and exhaled through her nose. She looked bored. No, thank you, she said calmly, though no one had offered anything. Not at this door. The soot cross twitched and then settled. The kettle made its small sermon. Presence, not invitation. The knock came again, more petulant, like a child that has learned both that rules exist and that adults are sometimes weak. Iris felt the pressure at her lips, a coolness that was more confident than yesterday. Her jaw wanted to slacken in response. She tied her tongue to her teeth with memory and breathed in through her nose until she tasted kitchen and coal and the ghost of ginger in Magda's tin. It let off. The knock traveled down the street like a rumor made visible. Next door, further on, toward the green. Iris felt it the way you feel a weather front in your old injuries. Come, Magda said briskly, standing, as if they had finished a task rather than evaded one. We'll take the long way to Pearl's and see if the doors are remembering. They found Deputy Reed half a street away, talking to Mrs. Dacey's lintel. Not to the woman, to the bell. We are not naming anyone at you, he was saying. A tone gentleman once used to teach dogs to sit. You may have Bell and Door and Dacey, because she put her name on the shop herself. You may not have Elsie even if she said it when she stubbed her toe. Mrs. Dacey watched, cheeks damp with the kind of tears that arrive from concentration rather than sorrow. It wrote L, she said, almost apologizing. I have grandchildren, Mr. Reed. It's habit to brag over a letter. We'll brag later, Reed said. We'll brag for free, not for weather. On the green, the smoke had arranged itself higher, chest level. The bronze faces were unhelpful. The air moved in a way the body interprets as benches rising and falling. Ivy was in her doorway with a broom, not sweeping, standing as if the broom were a friend whose presence said, "You can lean on me if you wish." Helena came as far as her path with her cardigan tight, and then stopped where her bell insisted. June trotted up with his notebook and solemnly informed Reed that the boiler had said he, at precisely 1:59, which would look terribly clever in his little ledger later. It happened quickly because it had learned failing slowly doesn't always increase success. At 2:02, A shape made itself from the chest-high smoke, shoulder to shoulder, like a woman wrapped in a gray shawl. Not a face. The suggestion of position where a face could be. It did not move toward any particular door. It turned its no-face toward the bronze women, and then to the school, and then to the Brickworks Museum with its big cold kiln, and then, last, toward Iris. She felt the pressure, and more obscene, somehow, the familiarity of the pressure. The mar began without voice. It trembled on the glass of the bakery, and on Helena's storm door, and on the side of the bus shelter, where someone had scratched out a swear years ago. Iris's mouth wanted to be helpful and finish the syllable. Magda's hand found Iris's sleeve and pinched, hard, a pain clean as a whistle. Iris breathed flew through her nose, so carefully her eyes watered. June stood on his toes. Boy, he told the shape fiercely, trying his new trick, and the smoke shied like a deer confronted with a gate where it had expected path. Elsie had a hand over her own mouth as if she were trying to keep a secret in, and found that she was won. Ivy backed into her bakery, broom still up like a flag. Reed took a single step toward the shape, then stopped, hands visible, mouth shut, everything in his body arranged to signal to the air, I am not prey, and you are not a god. The shape tried one more letter on the glass. H. It held there like breath on a mirror. Then the breeze came up from the river, the smallest stirring, perhaps a truck somewhere, perhaps Mercy wearing a disguise, and the shape thinned and went loose. The letter fogged away. The green, deprived of its need to be dramatic, went back to being a bowl of damp with people in it. After, people did what they do when they've survived. They drifted into conversation as if their bodies had simply continued walking forward through fear. Reed talked to Ivy about receipts. Helena scolded June gently for leaving his mother's scarf somewhere. Magda told Mrs. Dacey the ginger was too chewy and demanded a fresher tin tomorrow, which is how women pay each other to breathe. Iris stood very still until all the small signs of paused life, hanging hands, half-open mouths, eyebrows too high, had resumed and made Ashdown look like Ashdown again. At the archive, Pearl had laid out another of Lita's notebooks. 56, she said, tapping a page. Your Helena's Thel year. Lita had written. Smoke wrote H and M and L on glass. Did not progress when milk used. Did not like bells. Did not like women knitting. June's grandmother sang the flu words, and the boys slept better. Beneath that, different ink. Rowan Prynn reported smoke figure at 2. Looked like a shawl without a woman. Did not enter any door where bell hung. Followed her to green and waited. She did not say please or any names. She said soot, cinder, flew and waited for later. And then under a line, later came and went. We did not dig. We did not talk pretty to it. It learned to leave. I like your aunt's prose, Pearl said.
Bossy.
She could be. Iris said, aching in that useful way memory can ache when it has been invited rather than ambushed. She took a pen and wrote, under Lita's neat line, in her own uneven hand, 2025, figure at 2, wrote H and M. Tried Mar, refused. June says boy works. Reed sneezes on cue. Helena fed it milk.
We did not dig. We did not talk pretty to it.
It is courting. Pearl watched her write, and then pushed a largish envelope across the table.
From Lita, she said.
She left it with instructions for the day someone turned up with your face and that little hurry in your voice. Inside lay an iron trivet in the shape of a hand. Not decorative, practical, the kind you set a pot on without burning the table. A loop of red thread threaded through its finger. On Lita's note, for the stove when it talks. Hand on the heat. Threshold in the kitchen. If the smoke asks a question you're tempted to answer, put your palm on the iron and remember you're not a door. Iris wrapped her fingers around the trivet and felt its cool stubbornness. She imagined setting it on Lita's stove, milk pan on the palm, the little hiss when fat meets metal, the kitchen's answer to theological questions. She imagined the smoke being forced to practice its manners for the price of one household's inconvenience. On the way back to the cottage, she detoured to the Brickworks Museum. The big beehive kiln sat fat and retired, informational placard out front making cheerful propaganda out of dust. The docent, A thin man with a cardigan and a love affair with terracotta lit up at company. "There's a flue," he confided, leading her round the back. "The old draw. Bricked, of course. But you still feel cold here, eh?" He patted the wall. She remembers being useful. Iris laid her hand on the brick. It was indeed cooler, in that particular way that isn't shade or damp but the absence of heat earned by years of moving fire. "In 56, she said. "Did anyone see smoke appear here at 2? The docent looked startled. "Why, that's in the guest book Nana kept," he said. She wrote, "Named nobody. Let it pass. Tea at 3. Back at the cottage, Iris set Lita's iron hand on the stove and put the milk pan on its palm. The hiss was small and convincing. The bell under the lintel watched, brave and silent. The soot cross, which she had begun to think of as the house's eyebrow, held its line. At dusk, Ivy sent a loaf, the kind you don't slice because slicing feels like interrupting. June knocked, carefully, too short, with his actual knuckles, to ask if he could put his drawing of the boiler's breath in Pearl's file. Helena called to say the H had not returned to the glass. Elsie texted a picture of her braid, looser now, and a thumbs up, which in girl language means I am practicing not being eaten by my own fear. At midnight, the knock came again. Long, short.
2.
Long, long, short. Iris stood in the door with Magda at her shoulder, and the iron hand warm in the kitchen, and the milk steaming like a small, edible fog. She breathed through her nose until the desire to say Mar died like a candle under a bell. The night pressed once more, gently, with the tender entitlement of a neighbor who has borrowed sugar too many times and come to consider it a formality. Iris thought of thresholds, and of the women whose dust was in the mortar, and of the list in Lita's hand, and of the boy who had said boy instead of June and bin, thereby protected by his own wit. Later, she whispered through her nose, and the word did not feel like a promise. It felt like a fence. The pressure receded. The kettle ticked 3, then 2. The bell never rang. The soot cross did not change its mind. In the morning there were no crescents on the mat, only the faintest smear where the heel of a human hand had touched the stone, as if someone had steadied themselves there. Not a monster, but a memory practicing being neighbor. Iris swept it into the jar, and, for the first time since she'd written soot, front step, first night, she smiled as she labeled it.
Hand.
Outside. Remembered itself. Chapter 5. When the Mortar Spoke. By breakfast, the town hall had grown a skeleton. Scaffolding corseted the old tannery brick in galvanized silver. Canvas drop cloths snapped on the lee side like tablecloths in a short temper. A trio of masons in fleeces and damp-knuckled gloves were raking the joints with the care of men who no stone holds grudges. Every time a chisel worried out a line of tired lime, the air shrugged, a small release, cool on the teeth. Pearl had her cardigan buttoned wrong and didn't notice. "Repointing," she said, as if naming the work called down a protection. "Grant money. All very proper. They're using lime, praise be.
No cement.
Cement's a bully." She flicked her glance at the pearl grit in the old mortar. "And nobody yet has asked why our mortar glitters when it oughtn't." "Because we put our mothers in it," Iris said before she could decide to be more diplomatic. Deputy Reed had a clipboard and a spare bell. He hung the bell under the town hall arch where the double doors made the building's mouth, then tied the cord off with red wool in a square not Magda would have approved. "Humor me," he told the foreman, a large, patient man with a wet pencil behind one ear. "Knock off at 1:45 today, and take lunch 30 minutes late. If I'm wrong, I'll pay for pies. If I'm right, you'll keep your lads from learning the wrong kind of story." The foreman's face did that compound arithmetic men of trades do. Expense versus superstition versus the knowledge that ash lives in brick the way salt lives in bread.
"Fine," he said.
"We'll clean tools at 1:45 and light cigarettes we won't admit to." Dr. Harrow drifted up with his weather meter, which looked like a child's toy convinced of its own seriousness. He took one look at the scaffold shadow and said, "You'll hear a throbbing in the lintel at 1:58 and swear, correctly, that it is not mechanical." He tried to look sheepish and failed. "I'll be round the side with Pearl at the downspout, logging pressure." If the air misbehaves, tell it science is watching. Pearl pinched his arm gently. It doesn't mind science, she said. It minds vanity. They watch the masons work. Chisel, rake, brush, a rhythm steady enough to count a prayer or two. Old mortar fell in pale crumbs and darker flecks. Iris couldn't not see the pearly grit in it, a fugitive sheen, like the inside of a shell. Lita had underlined good eggs in the ledger when the town fired bricks hot with ash. The irony had aged into a civic quirk. If you cleared your throat in Ashdown, you tasted it. The remembered sweetness of burned apple and the ashy dryness of something that insisted on being called by a proper name. The bell under the arch did its excellent nothing, a brass punctuation to the day. At 12:20, Cass from the laundromat came in sideways, cheeks pink with public speaking. The dryer's writing L again, she told Pearl. I wiped with milk like you said, and it smelled like a chimney and stopped, but then the washer steamed up and did ma. I unplugged that one too and told the steam to pay its bill elsewhere. She looked at Iris as if to apologize for not being braver or for being too brave in the wrong way. I didn't say anybody's name. You're hired to be ungenerous with your alphabet, Pearl said. Keep it up. By one, the scaffolding crew had pulled sandwiches from coolers and wrapped their chisels in oily rags. Iris sat with Pearl on the town hall steps with mugs of tea that tasted faintly of sawdust. Municipal tea, democratic, indifferent. Across the green, Ivy wiped her bakery glass the way you pat a child after a coughing fit. More for your reassurance than its airway. Elise Ketch walked by humming a tune with no vowels in it, mouth closed, mindful. June Park, serious as a ruler, trotted past with a handbell he would not ring and a notebook he would. At 1:47, the air thinned. The sort of thin that makes a person who does not live there say, isn't that pleasant, and a person who does live there murmur something unprintable into their sleeve. Dr. Harrow's weather meter ticked like a guilty conscience. At 1:52, the first chisel laid on a plank made a louder sound than it warranted. At 1:55, the arch above the town hall door shivered, not visually, sensibly, the way a big animal does in summer when a fly tries a presumptuous landing. Hands, Pearl said, and everyone there who had learned anything the last 2 days found a pocket for their mouths. Reed pushed the double doors wide so the tongue of the building, hallway, stairs, committee room where democracy happens untidily, could arrange itself for company. He stood back out of threshold. No names, he said lightly. If you must offer a noun, make it architecture. The knock came as promised, not on wood, on air. Long, short.
2.
Then grown bold by rehearsal, long, long, short. The bell lifted on its strap like a sniff of disapproval. The town hall breathed in. From the joints the masons had raked, a cool exhalation ran. Not breeze, not draft. You could taste it. Old lime, river damp, the pearl grit sour sweet, and underneath, something metal, like a coin rolled against teeth. On the inside wall, where the portico became corridor, the new lime the men had pressed in at 10 o'clock made a darker patch. In the surface bloom, moist, not yet set, 2 strokes lifted and held. Then another, trying to occupy the same space, failing, and no further. Iris watched the lines bead, as if they were sweat, not writing. It tried the other door. On the west lintels inside, paint a finger width of clean appeared at breath height, as though somebody had written and wiped L 5 times. Reed put his knuckle to the wood and tapped twice. Not today, he said with bone. He did not say it with his mouth. Milk, Iris thought dumbly, though there was nowhere to put milk here that made sense. Then she remembered Lita's iron hand. She pulled it from her bag. It looked absurd in the daylight, a metaphor trying to not be, and set it on the radiator under the town's honor roll of dead. The iron collected room heat and held it in its palm with polite firmness. She went to Mabel's cafe across the lane and borrowed their jug and poured a shallow layer of milk into a pie tin and set it on the hand. It hissed and smelled like childhood. The corridor altered by a hair, the way a church shifts when a child stops crying. Fat binds smoke, Pearl whispered, professional as a chemist, and if the day had been funnier, they would have laughed. The breath from the mortar pulled back a little, then a little more. Like a cat deciding the lap is not worth the arguments being made. The wet M in the lime slumped into a harmless white, and an unambitious fly investigated and was disappointed. Dr. Harrow, who had closed his mouth and opened his eyes enough to be useful, pointed down at the ledger table where visitors sign their names when they come to argue about bins or praise a hedge. "We should take that up," he said, and Pearl, who usually resented suggestions, agreed at once. They did, and slid it back when the air had calmed. At 2:06, the knock tried once more with all the optimism of appetite. Long, short, too. A nameless hand. Nobody saw it, everybody felt it, pressed the new lime at shoulder height, and came away with nothing but lime on its skin. Reed sneezed. The air, caught between embarrassment and rage, thinned again. The bell under the arch did nothing, which was exactly the correct thing. After, the masons, who had pretended to ignore all civilizational absurdities, came to look. The foreman scratched his chin through stubble and eyed the pie tin on the iron palm. "My granddad used tallow in the wash," he said. "On barns. In the winter. Lime, water, fat. He said it kept out more than weather."
Pearl nodded.
"Your granddad was a scientist," she said, Ashdown's highest praise. "Add a little tallow to the last coat, if it lets you look in the mirror afterward. We'll call it conservation and send a nice thank you to the trust." On their way down the steps, they found Elsie Ketch using a heel of crust to wipe the letter H off Ivy's window like she was scrubbing chalk from a blackboard. "Milk next time," Ivy called, flustered and grateful and bossy in the same breath. "Bread's for mouths." "Windows are mouths if you let them," Elsie muttered, and gave the glass a last swipe. A ghost of the letter remained, a bruise of damp. Iris pressed her fingers to the pane and left 5 plain prints, overtopping it with human. It faded. She got as far as Lita's Lane before her phone quivered in her pocket. Cass again. It wrote CAS. "I told it no. Then I said it myself by accident."
Door.
Steam.
Coleman?
The word door uglified the text. Iris didn't answer with words.
She ran.
The laundromat humidity hit her throat silly. Steam hung low as though ashamed to go high. The bell under the lintel. Cass had, for once, done as she was told, dangled without opinion. On the glass of dryer 3, CAS showed backward, scrawled from the inside. Iris saw the exact place in time where a vowel would attach like a burr if allowed. Cass stood too near, arms tight across her chest as if to reduce the acreage of her name. "I didn't mean to," she said, small. "I said Cass, because that's what I used to scold me when I dropped quarters." "You're fine," Iris said, quick but not unkind. She moved by the habit she was growing, pan, stove, iron hand. There was no stove. There was a duct. She climbed onto a wobbling stool, popped the foil accordion of the dryer's vent with a grunt, and slipped the iron trivet's palm over the mouth like a second lid. It warmed at once with the drive of the machine. There was the faintest hiss, the sound of a word being deprived of lip. "Milk," she said, and Cass, good girl, frightened, capable, had a carton on the counter before Iris could take her hand off iron. They poured a little into a chipped tea saucer that had no business in a laundromat and set it on the iron's palm. It steamed sulkily. The letters on the glass softened. CAS blurred to see, which could be cup or cart or consequence, and was not useful. "Door," Iris said next, remembering the rule that the problem is rarely the machine. It is the threshold. She took up the bell's cord and, with the care of a midwife making a knot that will hold, tied it to her wrist and to Cass's belt. "We'll remember for you," she told the door. "We are not naming anybody at you. You may have spin, rinse, lint. You may not have Cassie. It tried anyway, poor thing, because that is what appetites do when they are asked nicely to become neighborly." The dryer blew warm damp, and then cooler. A shape, an almost shoulder, took the corner of the door in gray, then thought better and went to plume. Outside, on the mat, a small crescent of soot appeared, bare heel. Iris did not open the door to sweep it. She let it be. Cass put her head down on the counter and cried without sound, the kind of crying that costs something and buys a better afternoon. Iris, hand on the iron, kept her mouth shut and her body near, and thought of every ridiculous domestic act she had been taught that had turned out to be a ritual in disguise. When the steam gave up its letters entirely, Cass raised her head and sniffed like a civilized animal. "It's going to write a lot before it learns not to," she said, half to Iris, half to the machine. "It has time," Iris said. "So do we." That evening, the town hall scaffold shed a blue tarp that had hitchhiked and sent it down the green like a bad idea. June chased it and won. He stood on it while it spat wind. Elsie took a picture of Helena's stovepipe with milk steam making nice clouds. Pearl put the foreman's note in the file, added tallow to finish coat, and drew a heart beside it as if science would be bribed by affection. Just before dusk, Iris set the iron hand on Lita's stove and poured a ribbon of milk on the palm and watched it shiver itself into a skin. The bell under the lintels sighed its non-bell sigh in the cooling air. The soot cross did not add a flourish to please the day. Far off, the town hall, shored, braced, patient, remembered that it was a mouth and chose not to speak for a while. Chapter 6. The Closed Mouth Vigil. Word for it went out the way this kind of word prefers. Over fences, under breath, on receipts in Ivy's fat pencil. 2 o'clock had been busy 3 days running. It was time, Magda said, to be busier. Not a meeting, she warned. Those behave themselves for 10 minutes and then descend into men telling chairs their opinions. A sit, mouths shut, bells hung, milk on stoves. We will not give it the luxury of a dozen pretty conversations to shop from. Reed made a tidy diagram no one would see, pairing names to doors. Magda at Helena's, Ivy at Lita's with Iris, Mrs. Dacey with Cass, a penance for wiping with bread, Pearl with the foreman at the town hall arch, Dr. Harrow hovering 3 steps away with his device and his curiosity in a leash. June would be with his grandmother precisely because boys who take science seriously should also be taught to idle properly at strange hours. Elsie, who refused to be left off any list, was assigned to stand at the green south gate with a bell and closed lips, the arrangement chosen because resistance that age needs somewhere to put its brave. They began as midnight came like a practical joke, abrupt, unadorned. Iris slept for 1 hour with a rope of red thread around her wrist and cuff and chair, and woke on no alarm. She filled a pan, set the iron hand on the stove, and poured milk onto the warming palm until the kitchen smelled like nursery. She unlocked the back door and left it cracked the width of courtesy. She tacked Lita's index card to the inner face of the front door, and names at the threshold, as if paper mattered to weather. Ivy arrived with a loaf and a towel and a broom as a talisman and sat on the settling stool, shoes off, showing ankles to the air in a way that declared peace as policy, not helplessness. Magda arrived without knocking, woman of the house everywhere she went, and tied her red wool to the bell's cord and to the leg of the hall table. She put a saucer under the flue with half an inch of milk and set her stocky body in the chair like a wedge. Closed mouths, she said, which is what you say when someone younger looks too serious to be useful at 2 in the morning. They practiced absurd and righteous. The sound of agreement without giving away a vowel. HNN, the sound of disapproval that offers no syllable to steal. TCH, the scolding that is all consonant, no name. They laughed silently, and the house approved. Down the street, doors coughed open and stayed on their chains. Bells sat politely wherever threshold turned into intention. In Helena's cottage, the old woman hummed with her mouth closed, plying needles, the clack of wood on wool making the room's bones remember good labor. At the town hall, Pearl and the foreman drank bad tea near the pie tin of milk on the iron hand placed with ceremony on the radiator under the honor roll. The foreman talked about lime and tallow in whisper, and Pearl said when necessary, as if that were all the encouragement a man needed to feel useful. Dr. Harrow stood with his meter and his own mouth shut, astonished to discover that data can be devout. At the green south gate, Elsie leaned against the fence and wrapped her red thread an extra turn around her wrist to keep her hands from thinking for her. June stood at his grand's window and tried different ways of feeling heroic with everything but speech. Posture, eyebrows, the angle of a bell whose clapper had been removed. The night had personality. It wanted to tell stories. It did not like being asked to sit quietly in a room where others did not intend to perform. It pressed at Iris's lips. Ivy breathed through her nose and raised a broom 3 inches and set it back down. The stovepipe inhaled Ma, and Magda narrowed her eyes at it until the pipe blushed into more acceptable heat. At 1:58, a small, unreasoning panic tried the street. It isn't an event. Call it appetite shadow. Doors thought about being doors. Windows hid their breath. The green made a small theater of itself without an audience. Reed walked his line, hands visible, eyes careful, good coat unbuttoned so the knight would know he wasn't spoiling for a wrestle. The knock began its litany up the lane. Long, short.
2.
Long, short.
Long.
It hit the Dacey glass and found Cass and Mrs. Dacey sitting with tea and a clapperless bell, and not one syllable between them. It hit Helena's stove and found milk fat and wool and the bright chalk of needles counting something older than theology. It came to Iris's and found 3 women with their mouths shut, an iron hand steaming, and a label on the door that made an argument without using a verb. It pressed. Iris pressed back with nostrils and patience. The figure on the green did come, because things that are allowed must also be witnessed. It rose from the smoke at chest height. Shawl suggestion. No face. Familiar in the now familiar way that is somehow worse than unknown. It performed its turn. Toward the bronze women, toward the school's dark bricks, toward the town hall's arch. And then, in a decision that had to have been learned from watching people, it hesitated at the south gate. Elsie had her bell thrown down on the post like a little hat. She did not touch it. She set her foot against the milk, folded into skin and pulled apart and folded again the way language does when it is mispronounced. The new lime in the repointed joints darkened and refused flourish. The bell watched. Pearl put her finger an inch from the honor roll, not touching, the way you don't put fingers on names, closed her mouth and thought, with a patience that had taken 60 years to learn no. At the laundromat, Cass stared a hole through the dryer door and conjured shuttered vowels like a charm. Mrs. Dacey took a biscuit without asking, as if to insist on ordinary thefts where weather wanted larger indulgences. The steam tried Cass, a last time, and pouted when the iron hand made it feel foolish. It went on like that, houses answering with withholding rather than with gifts, the way good neighbors sometimes do when the other side of the hedge has had one too many. Then, because somebody always forgets, and it is not a sin, it happened where none of them had thought to be wary. At the Airbnb with the eucalyptus wreath. The couple from away, Amelia and her laugh, Tom and his backpack that did not fold nicely, had hung their key on the hook and poured wine, and stood in socks on antique floorboards admiring being in a town with a green and a story. At 2:03, the smoke pressed the door like a polite visitor. Amelia, good-hearted, unbriefed, trilled, "Come in," because in her part of the world, that is what you say to air that knocks on a mild night when you want your holiday to be well-behaved. The pressure went through like a guest ushered into a parlor. Letters tried themselves on the glass of the wedding-framed photograph, the eucalyptus on the wreath abashed to be used for grammar. Tom looked at Amelia, and the look said, "We will not tell the owner, it will be fine," which is a very persuasive kind of lie. "I'll fetch the rule," Reed said later, apologizing. "We should have hung bells across every door, not just ours." Then, at the time, he did what he could. He walked into the Airbnb like a man entering a wrong room gently and set a bell under the lintel with the speed of someone experienced at intrusions. He found the kitchen, turned on the stove, opened the flue, placed a skillet on the iron grate because there was no iron hand handy, poured milk into the pan, and watched it steam in the politely dangerous way milk steams when it intends to make a skin. "Don't say your names at it," he told the pair, as if offering them a menu. "If you need to address each other, use darling or you for the next quarter hour. If you must complain, do it by mime. If you have bread, put it on the sill for me to eat later, and call it an offering. Has anyone knitted?
No. Fine.
Think boring thoughts at it. Numbers. Lists. Tax bands." Tom obeyed like a man who has never been so relieved not to be the one providing competence. Amelia clung to the inside of her mouth like a swimmer clings to a lane. The wreath rustled. The milk made it skin, and then frowned, and made another. The smoke pressed and found only fat and refusal. It went loose and dignified in defeat, as if to say it had errands at better houses. "We'll send you the pamphlet," Reed said when it was over, contrite and wry and professional all at once. "You'll enjoy it. It reads like a recipe." He shook their hands without giving his name. He went out into the night with the bell under his arm like a borrowed book and a face preparing to be yelled at by Magda. By the time he got to Lita's lane, the knock had given up being coherent and had scattered into something like weather again. Iris sat with her mouth shut and her hands around her mug and the iron hand cooling next to the empty pie tin, and Ivy had fallen asleep with a broom across her lap like a peculiar sword, and Magda had the mild, irritated look of a woman who has stayed up later than her blood sugar prefers.
Done.
Magda asked without grammar. He nodded. She narrowed her eyes and sniffed Amelia off him like a hound. "You didn't warn them," she said without blame. "You will now." "I will now," he said. They broke the vigil the way one does. Clatter restrained, chairs reticent, smiles small like children who have successfully tricked sleep into visiting without being caught. Through the town the same rituals unwound. A saucer carried to the sink, a bell left to think about its life under the lintel, a boy congratulated for keeping his vowels to himself, a girl untwining wool from her wrist without cutting. At the hall, the foreman checked the pie tin under the honor roll and looked faintly proud of it. Pearl filled the visitor's book back into its place and put a blank one above it with 2 o'clock notes written on the cover in her patient hand, a gift to future Pearl. At the green, Elsie set her bell on the post and exhaled with her nose and measured herself and found she had gained an inch of sense without losing any of her indignation. She texted Iris a picture of the post with no letters on it and a caption of 3 red thread emojis, which, translated, meant, "I did not say my name. I am furious about it. I'm fine." The kettle in Lita's kitchen ticked 3, then 2. Later, it said, and the later arrived. Outside, on the mat, not a heel or a toe but a flat. Whole print remained, a hand, 5 plain smears, as if some old thing had put itself down and steadied on Iris's threshold and decided, for that night, not to be a guest or a thief, but simply a passerby who nodded at the door and kept going. Iris swept it into the jar with the others and wrote on the label, "Hand again. Polite." Then she slept, short and sure, and dreamed not of smoke, but of milk taking on skin and surrendering it, again and again, because that is how fat teaches persuasion to the air. In the morning, Magda put a short stack of copied cards on Ivy's counter. Ember weather rules flew open, bell hung. No names at thresholds, milk for pipes, bread for mouths, red thread for scents. Sneeze if you must. Breathe through your nose. If you forget, we will remind you. Ivy shoved them into greasy bags between turnovers and rye as if feeding rules to strangers might keep them from mispronouncing the town. It did not stop the green from rehearsing. It taught it manners. It did not stop the mortar from remembering. It gave the mortar words it could keep to itself. It did not keep Ashdown safe from Story. It kept Story from being the only thing Ashdown was. At noon, with Sun making a liar of the inversion for a half hour, Iris stood outside the town hall and put her palm on the repaired joint. The tallowed lime was dry and closed to easy suggestions. Her hand came away with the faintest pearl grit on its lines. She looked at it and did not wipe it on her skirt. She rubbed her fingertips together until the grit went to nothing and left a shine, as if her hand had learned to keep the smallest bit of wall for later. Chapter 7. What Marjorie Left. The soot line above Lita's kitchen lintel had become a habit Iris trusted more than most people. It told her how the day meant to behave. That morning it held steady and fine, no flamboyance, the way a good eyebrow stays exactly where it should when the rest of the face wants to make trouble. She had resolved to do one honest task before noon, something with edges. Sorting Lita's stove drawer seemed possible. Corkscrew, snuffer, matches and a rubber band, 3 twist ties rescued from bread bags, a china thimble, a small rolled map of nothing in particular, and 4 envelopes with the addresses ripped away. One of them, thicker than the rest, had mortar written on it in Lita's careful print. Inside were 4 things: a rubbing and soft pencil of the town hall's old joint work, the telltale pearl grit smudged into the paper like stars. A brittle clipping from an 1899 newsletter advising the respectful admixture of wood and bone ash into lime for the pleasing brightening of domestic mortars. Lita had underlined bone 3 times and written yours in the margin. A small paper packet tied with thread, labeled Vale Hearth, Western Jam, and a folded letter in ink brown with age, addressed to whichever of mine keeps house here. Her skin knew it before her head permitted excitement. Marjorie Vale's hand. The inked lines leaned like someone too practical to be perturbed by ink's wish to bloom. Iris unfolded it the way you open a note a dead woman has left for your mouth. I have always kept the right door open and the wrong one shut. They burned me on a Thursday and ate bread on the green the next day with their wives. Some of those wives are ours.
Do not stiffen at that.
There is no use getting all the way to heaven only to remember your neighbors as fewer than they were. We are mixed. They put ashes where they should not, to teach the walls to behave, and so the walls behave like women taught badly. They remember everything in case it should save somebody later. If the air in the town begins to ask what it should not, remember it is a child raised wrong, not a god. Keep your flue unlatched on ember days, so nothing has to learn a door. Hang a bell with no tongue where names are likely to be stolen. If the throat of the house tries to say, Mar, put your palm on the hot iron like you are about to take a pan from the fire, and do not speak, not even to apologize for not speaking. Bread is for mouths that belong to bodies. Fat is for pipes. If you must say our names, say them at a table with your friends, not at your threshold where the wrong things learn to be polite.
Do not dig.
Do not beg. Do not make a show. If there must be a vent, make it in the place where heat was made, not in the earth where we were corrected in public. The kiln is a better mouth than the gallows. Feed it milk when it sulks. Teach the children to breathe through their noses like decent creatures. If someone from away says this is superstition, give them a slice and ask them if they prefer a town that knows its habits or one that forgets them for money. Marjorie Vale, who has scrubbed a hearth and other things that stained worse. The paper smelled faintly of soot and lavender. Under the letter in the envelope, a thin flake of mortar sat folded in waxed paper, the way bakers keep a bit of last week's starter to bully this week's yeast. Lita had written on the fold, Western Jam, Marjorie's print. Iris turned the sliver in her fingers. A faint crescent of darker grit shone along one edge, like old pearl crushed, like something once bone. She set the letter on the table where sunlight found it. The packet told her where to look. Western Jam. She pressed along the inner edge of the hearth. The old bricks Lita had refused to face with tile because a face is a lie unless its bones can agree. One brick had the softened wobble of something that has been handled with love for too long. Iris eased it free. Not digging, not prying at the town, just letting a stone confess a small secret, and found a shallow, soot-glazed niche no bigger than a palm. All that remained inside was a blackened thumbprint, sunk into mortar before it set, a whirl that belonged to a woman who preserved bread heat and names with equal resolve. Iris laughed, not silly, saved. She put her own thumb next to it and felt that slight give of lime's skin under finger.
She did not speak.
She did not promise anything aloud. She put the brick back and felt the hearth take it again, without complaint. She carried Marjorie's letter to Magda with the reverence of a woman delivering a birth certificate after the person has long been born. Magda read it with her mouth a straight line doing the hard work of not curving. She writes like a woman who has been scolded into schooling her rage. Magda said, affection and fury in the same breath. And she cooks like a scientist. She says the kiln, Iris said. Not the green. A vent there. Milk.
Bells.
A mouth that deserves the job. Magda looked pleased and tired in the way flour looks when it's about to be persuaded into bread. Tell Reed, she said. Tell Pearl. Tell the foreman with the tallow. Men like instructions when they're good and practical, and let them be valiant without changing their hats. At the town hall, the scaffold had shifted its shade again, and the new lime was drying well, pale as sour cream under the sun. Pearl read Marjorie's hand like a ledger and swore softly, which in her mouth had the weight of a prayer. Dr. Harrow, incurably academic, said, "A beehive kiln draws like a lung. The old flue is bricked, but if we opened an inspection brick, we'd be giving the town a chimney it can use on bad days." Pearl finished, cheeks pink for reasons that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with hope that wasn't ashamed of itself. We might even explain it to the trust as ventilation for heritage fabric. Reed came at a jog that was careful not to be a run. He read the letter and tilted it toward the light like a boy with a beetle in a matchbox. "The kiln," he said, and looked at the Brickworks Museum across the green. "The docent will have a fit if we touch anything. We will give him a badge and call him an officer of vents." The foreman heard them out and scratched the roll of his pencil across the stubble on his jaw.
"Aye," he said.
"I can lift one brick if I'm allowed to cement it back with the right wrong. Tallow and lime and a dab of the old mortar to keep the history calm." He said history like a man says stream, a thing that's not to be blocked if you want to grow good beans. They agreed to try at 4, that hour between town hall's afternoon boredom and shopkeeper's evening ambition, because 2 belonged to Ash and someone had to keep the habit honest. Pearl wrote a thing called a permission and Reed signed it and then made the foreman sign it too, which pleased everyone in the room who enjoys the piety of forms. At home, Iris set the iron hand on the stove and the pie tin on the palm and poured milk. The hiss said correct. The kettle ticked its little answer 3, then 2. She tucked Marjorie's letter into Lita's ledger under ember weather rules and felt, in her ribs, the way a house feels when a shelf is right. She told Ivy while buying bread she didn't need. Ivy read the letter and snorted, loving Marjorie at once in the way bakers love anyone who tells hard truths and shares ovens.
"Kiln," she said.
"You'd think we'd have tried the obvious years ago. We don't go looking for a better mouth when we're busy teaching thresholds the rules," Iris said. "Today," Ivy said, and handed her a heel of rye with a shrug. "For feeding bravado. At 2 o'clock the green rehearsed the figure, because that is what you do when you have a show at 4. It lifted its shawl without a woman in it and made H and M on the air as if to say, 'I know where you live.'" Iris stood at Lita's window with her lips closed and her thumbs on the sill the way a woman holds a page down when the wind wants to turn it. The figure thinned as the clock made the sentence go on. At 4, the brickworks smelled of warm dust and older stories. The docent, cardiganed and keen, was already flushed with importance and terror. The beehive kiln sat with its mouth shut, sanctified by signage, and a velvet rope Reed lifted with 2 fingers as if absolving a child for stealing a biscuit. Around the base, back where the draw had once pulled smoke like thread, the foreman kneeled with mallet and cold chisel, and a prayer in the shape of holding his breath. Pearl set the iron hand on a portable radiator Iris had wheeled across the green, and the pie tin on the palm, and the milk in the tin. Magda stood with her red thread to the bell Reed had insisted on hanging off a scaffold clamp. Elsie Ketch leaned against the kiln with her mouth shut, and a defiant calm she could never have achieved if anyone had asked it of her. June took notes like a second scribe who intends to be polite to the first. The first tap of the chisel made the kiln say a wordless, "Ah, not pain," surprise. The docent flinched and then placed his hand on the brick the way polite men place hands on horses the first time. "Hello, I will not insult you." The foreman eased a brick the size of a loaf end out of the old mouth. Behind it, black where bricks remember fire, was the throat, cool breathed out. Not cemetery cool, cellar cool, useful cool. A trickle of ash that had never been fully ash sifted onto the foreman's boot and made a comma there. Reed didn't step forward. He did not step back. He moved so the arch of the kiln's mouth and the bell and the pie tin formed a triangle that would please a geometry teacher. "We are not naming anyone at you," he said, through his nose, through his chest, through a voice he refused to offer to the wrong wind. "We have made a vent so you can practice being decent. Here is fat for your throat. Here is a bell for your door. Here are neighbors, not heroes." The day had contrived to go still. Even the greens seemed to pause, bronze women done being saints for a quarter hour to watch what work looked like. The kiln breathed in, then out. The old draw remembered being clever and took the milk steam, not hungrily, professionally. The smell went up and came back down to their tongues, childish and holy. At the town hall arch, the new lime did nothing dramatic, which was better than something. At the laundry, the dryers turned and made no letters. Helena's stove inhaled and, finding a kiln to answer to, declined to be the protagonist. At Lita's threshold, the bell under the lintel studied the room like a cat and decided there would be no entertainment here for a while. At 4:07, a shape rose at the kiln mouth, brief, smoke exact where smoke is never exact. A shawl suggested, no face, no name trying itself upon anything, just the posture of someone who had learned, at last, to ask without asking too much. It lifted one arm in the smallest not greeting. Iris did not wave. She pressed her palm to the kiln brick and felt heat that was not present heat, but stored, like a room that remembers laughter even after laughter leaves. Later, Magda breathed, habit, rule, mercy in one word. The bell did not ring. The pie tin hissed as a milk skin formed and parted and formed again, and Pearl wiped one eye with the back of her wrist, as if she had missed a piece of mortar dust. The foreman slid the brick back into place not as a jailer closing a cell, but as a woman latching a door to keep weather out while soup simmers. He pressed his tallow lime mix into the seam with his thumb, and then set his thumbprint there, boldly, to make the repair honest. For the record, he said to nobody, I dislike cleverness that needs my boots. But this I can say yes to. The docent exhaled for the first time since they'd begun. We will write a placard, he said, trembling between mischief and piety. Vent installed for conservation of fabric.
Period.
And I'll know what it was for. June drew the hole like a badge and labeled it in a child's script mouth and underlined it twice. Elsie took a picture and didn't send it to anyone, which is its own kind of reverence. Reed shook the foreman's hand and then Magda's and then stood a minute, sleeves rolled, shirt damp at the throat, looking as if he would like to tell the world it had done well without giving the world the satisfaction of hearing it in his voice. Iris went home with Marjorie's letter warming the pocket where you'd keep a lucky coin and set the iron hand on the stove and poured a ribbon of milk onto the palm while the day tried to decide whether it would reward courtesy. The kettle ticked 3, then 2. On the mat, no crescents. On the lintel, the soot cross no darker, no lighter. On the glass of the front window, nothing wrote anything, and it felt like a miracle, which is to say very much like a relief. Just before sleep, she took the letter from under the ledger and read the last line again. If there must be a vent, make it in the place where heat was made, not in the earth where we were corrected in public. She slept and dreamed of thumbs and lime, of bricks easing out and back with no complaints, of a room of women who have been burned and then asked to teach their daughters to boil milk with patience. At 2, the green lifted its shawl, and then remembered the kiln, and went to see what doors mean when doors are behaving. The Airbnb's eucalyptus wreath didn't rustle. The laundromat wrote nothing. The school boiler inhaled and exhaled like a very old dog that has been given a corner of the kitchen and declines to bite. Chapter 8. The Beehive Breathes. They didn't call it a ritual because the town does not enjoy giving the wrong idea to the right words. They called it maintenance, and somehow that flattered everyone properly. The docent at the brickworks took to polishing the exposed brick around the little reopened draw with a soft brush the way a person tends a grave without having to admit to grief. Pearl taped a card beside the new old mouth in clear, municipal plastic. Vent for breath. Not for names. Word did what it does, which is to pretend it is still private when it has long since put on shoes and gone out for a look. In the afternoon, a woman from away with a hat over her cleverness asked the docent whether the kiln had always had a hole. The docent said, of course, and it was true enough. At tea, Ivy had to tell 3 people not to sing to their bread, her sign, and no names at the counter, but you may call me IVY, hung in the window and made people kind.
The pressure changed.
Not like weather, like mood. Men put their shoulders down a hair and loosened the set of mouth that tells a day where to put its anger. Children breathed better at midday and dreamed less at 2. Pets stopped eyeing under the stove with the accusatory concentration that makes owners apologize even when they've done nothing. The figure on the green did not show at 2 on the which for some was a disappointment and for others a holiness. It came later, loitering, as dusk took its pearly hack at the world. Not at the green. At the kiln. Not dramatic. Curious. Someone's mother peering round the pantry door to see if the teenager had left a mess, ready to scold or praise depending upon whether the butter had found its wrapper. It rose thin from the drawer and leaned its knot face into the milk steam, which struck Iris as funny and made her want to put a saucer on the floor as if for a cat. "It will ask," Pearl said. They were sitting on packing crates because benches intimidate sincerity. Not with names. With pretty. We'll have to be tidy. We'll have to decide what it gets to learn. "What can a kiln teach?" Dr. Harrow asked, warming to the possibility that matter knows things it can be asked to share without being abused. Draw, draft, the honest way heat earns a place to go. That if you make a mouth, you owe it a job. Magda, who had knitted 3 inches of something not large enough to have to declare its purpose, said, "A kiln can teach stay put. It can also teach we are going to make something from the mess. Both seem useful." The foreman passed with a brick in his hand as if it were a baby that needed to see the world to stop crying. He set it on a pallet like a throne and nodded to the vent and said, almost shy, "I put my thumb on the seam. I hope your lot don't mind." "Our lot have always liked a thumbprint," Magda said, and laid her own against the cool next to his where the tallow had taken and the lime had grudgingly accepted skin. Iris began to bring the iron hand at 4 without having to be told. She set the pie tin to hiss on the palm and fed the kiln the smallest ribbon of milk that turned into a smell of bad school pudding, which is to say nostalgia in disguise. The bell reed had hung on the scaffold clamp sat there like punctuation, as if it were waiting to be called upon to be a semicolon. At dusk, Elsie stood with her arms folded, face staring the air to practice on her. June leaned his forehead on the kiln wall and listened as if heat were a language he would one day be fluent in. Helena arrived with a shortbread tin. Pruitt demonstrated how to breathe through your nose like a decent mammal, and the children obligingly pinched their lips for the length of a hymn, as if playing a game. Reed put bells under the Airbnb lintels in the new houses and left a pamphlet titled Welcome to Ashdown. A few queer rules in each kitchen with a loaf from Ivy to soften the oddness. People tried and failed, and were reminded and tried again. A woman on Quarry Lane forgot herself and told the threshold she was home with her whole face, and a knock with ideas pressed the door. Her husband sneezed as if his life depended on it, and it detached like a burr. A boy at the green shouted his own name to hear it bounce, and 2 grannies scolded in harmony, without opening their lips. And then, as if the town had earned a new level of curriculum, the smoke wrote something else. Not letters, not at first. A handprint, flat. 5 smears on the brand new mortar near the town hall arch. Not sooty like the old crescents, but clean, damp without dirt, water without intention. There and gone as sun hit it. Reed saw it first and didn't tell anyone for an hour, because sometimes keeping a fact in your pocket makes it behave better. When he did show Pearl, she put her hand next to the absence and presence and made her fingers match. "It will have what we leave room for," she said. We left room for hands. That evening at the kiln, with the milk hissing, the figure rose and did not try to be more than it was. Iris, cheek damp from the heat that never reached her face, did something she had not done in weeks. She opened her mouth.
Not to speak, to sing.
Closed lips humming. No vowels, no names. The old tune Lita hummed to kettles, the same one babies are taught when they are meant to use sleep instead of logic. Magda joined without looking at her knitting. Pearl, extremely against her own rules, smiled into the sound. June, unable to bear not improving things, added a low and in the corner that made everyone's ribs behave. The kiln took it and warmed it and sent it up, and when it came down again, it smelled like cake on a Sunday in a house that will have no visitors, but expects them anyway. The figure steadied as if it had been told which chair was its, and that it was not expected to rush. "Ask," Elsie said unexpectedly, teenage mouth closed, eyes ferocious and kind, as if testing whether a word with no vowels could get through the new terms. The figure didn't write it. It inclined only that. Reed cleared his throat behind them in a way calculated not to interrupt anything holy. I could get used to maintenance, he said. You always could, Magda said, satisfied. In the days after, the knock still tested doors. Names tried themselves in throats and were denied, politely, the privilege of being spoken to empty rooms. The kiln breathed the way old kilns breathe when people stand near and tell it about their days. The green wore its shawl less low. People went about their chores with bells at their doors the way other towns put pots of rosemary on steps and call it taste. They stayed in their bodies on purpose and kept their words for each other. Marjorie's letter lived under the ledger like a recipe inherited from a woman who knew that if you were going to teach the young how to keep house, you must leave them more than one way to avoid burning milk. On a Wednesday with honest rain and nobody in a temper, the town hall foreman came to the kiln with his crew at 4 with a thermos and a bag of biscuits. He touched the brick he had eased out and in, thumbprint and all, and said to the whole, not with challenge, with hospitality, "We'll be on with the pointing tomorrow. You'll smell lime." That isn't a threat. The kiln agreed in the small way kilns agree. It kept being a mouth and did not ask for a story it had not earned. Iris took home the iron hand, dried it, set it back in Lita's drawer next to the snuffer and the corkscrew and the twist ties and the china thimble. She tied her red thread back to her cuff and then put her palm on the western jam and the old thumbprint in the mortar and said, mouth closed, chest gentle, like she meant it to be a long habit and not a performance. Neighbor. On the green, the bronze women at last looked like they were getting some rest. The air pressed a door on Quarry Lane very gently and found a bell and a card and a woman with flour on her hands and a man who sneezed on cue and 2 children who had been taught their own names were gifts not to be thrown at the weather. And the air took itself elsewhere to the kiln where a pan of milk was hissing in a way that made a person think of being small and safe and spooned. The town kept at it. The smoke in time kept at it too. Chapter 9. The Feast of Later. The inversion cracked but did not leave. It went brittle, like patience that has been handled too often. Sun skittered across Ashdown without warming anything important. The bells under lintels did their excellent nothing. The soot crosses held their posture. The kiln breathed like a well-trained chest. And yet the day had that fine metallic edge that makes you suspect glass underfoot. Pearl arrived at Lita's with municipal news and a bag of scones whose raisins had rearranged themselves during transport into a map Ashdown would have argued over for weeks if it had cared to. County wants a ceremony, she said, grim and wry in one face. Tourism council, lanterns, speeches on the green, microphones. The last word in Pearl's mouth sounded like a sin she wouldn't waste absolution on. Microphones on ember weather, Magda said from the kettle, incredulous, without needing volume. Amplify your names at thresholds. Invite the wrong ears to the wedding. They'll do it if we don't give them something to do, Pearl said. They like their grief tidy and their photos with a nice horizon. We need a different horizon. Iris opened Marjorie's letter and set it on the table with the heavy casualness of a talisman you refuse to let become theater. The kiln, she said. A vent where heat was made. Not the green. Table, not threshold. Feast, Ivy said from the doorway, as if the word had been waiting under her tongue for months. Not speeches.
Bread.
Milk.
Bells.
We call it the Feast of Later. We tell names to each other, not to the air. We do it at dusk, so the green feels admired and the kiln feels busy. She straightened the towel over her shoulder as if aprons confer priesthood. I'll bake the buns that smell like school pudding so the town remembers the right story. Reed, who had been practicing the art of arriving at exactly the moment a plan required a hinge, stepped over Lita's threshold with the iron hand under his arm like a book. We can stand the council on their heads, he said, hopeful and practical. Call it heritage maintenance. No microphones. Kettle corral. Every table has a bell and a saucer. Names read to plates and ears, not to the green's wind. Nobody stands the council on their heads, Pearl said, mildly pitying his youth. We'll set them in chairs and feed them until their mouths learn what they are for. She glanced at Marjorie's letter and nodded toward the sentence that had bullied her into hope yesterday. We used the kiln's draw to teach the town's breath a habit. The foreman agreed to put a scaffold plank along the kiln's yard as a trestle. The docent at the brickworks grew so flushed with the nobility of being useful, he had to sit down with his cardigan unbuttoned while Pearl explained placards about heritage events in small words. June brought his notebook and drew a map of tables and bells and milk pans, as if planning a battle with niceness, as the only weapon allowed by treaty. Elsie volunteered to sit at the south gate of the yard and glare any microphone into remorse, which she could do based on established talent. News went out through conduits the council would never find. The receipt Ivy slid into paper bags under rye and under the sugar buns grease. Magda's notes pinned to notice boards in thread that matched the lintel bell's chords. Reed's knuckle on doors at 10 in the morning with a pamphlet titled The Feast of Later. No names at thresholds, bread at tables. Pearl's municipal email, sent with a subject line that sounded like funding and held a body text that read like ritual. At 2, the Green rehearsed a half-hearted drama and then lost interest when nobody offered a stage. The figure did not lift. The shawl of smoke lay folded low. Reed walked past the council's event coordinator, an apologetic woman named Claire with a lanyard and a talent for compromise, and told her, kindly, that lanterns would blow out in this air and cameras would sulk. Come at dusk, he said. Hungry. Claire did, offended by usefulness, then seduced by it. At 4, Ivy's ovens released a smell that braided every childhood in the town with the present tense. Burnt sugars edged domesticated by butter. The thick vanilla that coats grief into something that can be swallowed. At 5, Pearl and Dr. Harrow set the iron hand on the kiln's radiator and the pie tins in a row like geese. At 6, bells hung from trestles and elbows and lanyards. At 6:10, the docent put the placard beside the vent with the ceremony of a ribbon cutting and exactly the lack of ribbon that made him feel virtuous. It read, Vent for breath, not for names. Beneath in small he had added, Please hum. They ate. Tables into rows that didn't become pews because elbows brushed kindly. A yard that didn't become church because the sky insisted on being irreverent. Bread broke and made soft noises. Milk steamed in pie tins and withstood sentences. Bells stood like punctuation and made punctuation possible. Comma, pause, semicolon. Nobody let them attempt a period. People told each other names over plates. The names that would not be given to thresholds. Rowan, Sibylla, Goodwife Ash, Marjorie Vale, Tamsin, Helena, Nand, Elspeth, Thomasin, and when the names moved into the steam, the kiln drew them properly, not to store, not to squander, to mind. June read a list that had no rhythm because it wasn't poetry. It was a receipt. We opened flues. We hung bells. We fed milk to pipes.
We did not dig.
We did not beg. We did not make a show. Elsie refused to read anything aloud and instead stood on the plank like a small, ferocious gargoyle and looked for microphones and found only mouths chewing and determined none of them were dangerous. Claire from the council cried quietly into a bun and later told Reed she had never seen a town eat grief so well. Reed said that had always been their best agricultural product, and Claire did not try to make it a brochure. The figure rose toward the end, not to be admired, to be counted among the present. It stood at the kiln's mouth like a woman too shy to enter a brightly lit room and was offered a chair anyway. No face. A shawl suggested by smoke's slowness at corners. It tilted its knot head toward the pan of milk and then toward the bread, as if taking attendance. A hush-earned, not imposed bell. People hummed, mouths closed, the old kettle tune that ties elbows to elbows. The draw took the sound and warmed it, sent it up the flue and back down the vent, and the yard smelled like fullness instead of lack. Pearl, who cannot leave a plan without an appendix, stood and placed a card on the plank where the figure might read it, if reading is something smoke can do. Later, a rule, a promise, not a refusal. Magda laughed once, pleased and unfold. Go on with you, she said to the air, without using her mouth. It could not entirely go on with anything. A stiff breeze shouldered in from the river. The inversion's brittle lid shivered, and somewhere to the east a section of the town hall's scaffold canvas snapped loose and pinwheeled like a badly behaved angel. The yard's air changed. Not malevolent, unsettled. The council's hired lighting rig flickered once, and thought better of being dramatic. "Hold," Reed said, quiet bone level. He stepped toward the scaffold as men with authority step toward animals they do not intend to punish. The foreman was already there with a mallet, efficient but gentle, securing a clamp that had taken offense at being asked to contribute to a party. In the moment when the canvas tilted and made shadows too quick to be admired, the figure did its worst trick in months. It turned toward a child. Not on purpose. The way a draft turns toward a crack it didn't know was there. At the edge of the yard, Ida, 7, Freckles, elfin courtesy, had strayed from her grandmother's lap and stood on the threshold of the museum door, transfixed by the way milkskins change their minds. The door was open to welcome looseness. The air pressed Ida's lips with that gentle, greedy touch the town had come to suspect. She took a breath in the wrong place. Iris moved before her ego had time to make a plan. She crossed the space between her and Ida with the low, unstartling speed you use when you do not want a shy cat to sprint. She bent, put her palm against the girl's cheek, and pressed the bell cord into Ida's small hand. "Breathe like you're smelling bread," Iris said, nose. "Patience, habit." Ida obeyed. She was an obedient child when the instruction was tactile. Iris made her face boring, and Ida reached for imitation like children do when they want to be brave, without being told that is what they are. She sucked air through her nose, slow. The press at her lips considered pity and found none. It pulled back. The figure saw the motion it had not intended and flinched, which is the only word for what smoke can do when it learns it has been thoughtless. It shifted toward the kiln with the humility of a misdelivered letter. It stood there like a woman who has been handed the wrong baby at a christening and knows better than to panic in public. "Later," Magda said, and this time the word felt like a funny story told after relief. She lifted Ida's hand and made the bell's cord a little bracelet.
"For the night," she said.
"Return it in the morning. We will pretend I'm cross you forgot to." The wind discovered its manners. The canvas calmed. The draw performed. The yard exhaled. The figure thinned. The bread returned to being bread instead of liturgy. People forgot themselves into conversation and called it the right thing because it was. "Pearl, pen already out," wrote Ida, door. "Smell bread in the ledger," and added, as if annotating a recipe with optional spice, child-sized bells. Claire asked if she could print some, and Pearl informed her printing was permitted in counties that had behaved themselves, and even some that hadn't. When the feast of later ended, it had not announced an enemy defeated. It had made the town duller in exactly the way Ashdown prefers. Habits, not heroics. Cups stacked. Pans washed. Milkskins peeled and fed to the kiln like training wheels. Bells rehung. Children carried home asleep, nose breathing. The figure put its knot hand on the kiln's lip for one brief, brazen moment. Where it touched, a faint damp handprint marked the brick and evaporated as the foreman swore softly at his own sudden sentiment. Iris walked home with the iron hand under her arm, the letter in her pocket, and a loaf in her bag she would not need. The soot cross on Lida's lintel looked like good punctuation. The kettle ticked 3, and then 2 without condescension. On the mat, under the bell, a small scatter of pearl grit had fallen from someone's cuff, mortar dust, the walls minding themselves. In bed, Iris thought of Ida's cheek and the correct weight of her own palm, and the way small bells can teach large doors their jobs. She slept the kind of sleep a town gives you as a tip when you've been an adequate neighbor. At 2, on the green, the shawl lifted and then settled with the comic solemnity of a hen rechosing a nest 3 inches to the left. It did not try any letters. It did not practice pretty. It sat a while at the kiln and watched its own breath be useful. Chapter 10, Hand to Hearth. The weather earned itself a mood. The inversions split like pulled sugar, treacly threads going their separate ways in the highway heat, while above, a front sulked in and stalled. Offshore wind shouldered the river and made the green look, just for an hour, like a lake that had forgotten to manifest. The town hall's scaffold sang its minor key, Ivy's awning flicked in small angers. The bells glanced at each other with the insolence of useful objects granted too much community. Pearl came down the town hall steps with her cardigan unbuttoned, sign of hurry, and a face that put her in the category of people not careless enough to panic. "The trust sent a man with a spray," she said, breath neat, anger folded. "Acrylic sealer. He used it on the East Arch before I could recite a list of his ancestors. It's already made the mortar shiny, like wrong bread. The wall refused him by being handsome, and he thought that a compliment." "Sealed breath," Dr. Harrow said, turning gray as if someone had taken away one of his lab taps. "We taught the wall to breathe. He taught it to sweat." Reed's neutral expression acquired teeth. "Where?" She took him to the East Arch, where the repointed joints gleamed in a way lime never should. Reed put his palm to it and recoiled. The heat trapped under the sealer made the wall's skin too hot. "This," he said, not loudly, "is how you suffocate a town without closing any of the doors." "Vinegar will take some of it," the foreman said, long-suffering, appearing with a jug and a brush and a face like a man forced to do penance for his cousin.
"And time."
"And luck." He dappled an inch. The glossy wrong dulled resentfully. "Call off your 2 o'clocks," Claire from the council said, genuinely stricken at having brought a man with a lanyard to a knife fight and watched him stab the wrong thing. "If the wall can't give, it will take." "We don't cancel weather," Magda said, moving past with a child's bell in each pocket like a shoplifter of grace. "We redirect it to a mouth with a job. We have a kiln." They deployed like people who had learned, in a month, a language they should have been born speaking. Reed hung 2 more bells under the East Arch and ran his hand along the eaves for a hidden vent. The bell cords touched his wrist like the presence of friends who don't need to be announced. Pearl ferried vinegar, and the foreman ferried patience. Dr. Harrow, uncharacteristically unacademic, fetched pails and refused to write anything down until after he had bruised his own thumbs doing one honest thing. Iris went to the kiln yard with the iron hand and the pie tins and the pan that had seen more milk in 3 weeks than in 10 years. The docent had propped the vent brick an inch to demonstrate air politely. The vent breathed like a patient waiting to be asked a sensible question. Ivy arrived with buns she would not sell and a broom that had earned the right to lean. Elsie stood at the south gate, braid loose, mouth closed, her glare tuned for visiting bureaucracy. June set a stool by the draw and swung his heels and hummed the kettle tune to keep himself from crying and did not need to cry. At 1:58, the wall under the East Arch said no by sweating under sealer. The town's breath went looking for the old habit. The green, the open doors, the inversions lid. The bells answered in their chosen idiom. Silence with backbone. Milk hissed on iron. The kiln lifted its throat like a trained singer taking a breath of correct length. And still it rushed. The press at mouths all over the town had a poverty to it that made the skin crawl. Grasping, not asking. Doors braced. Children smelled bread. The soot crosses did not find excuses for drama. At Lita's, the whistle of a kettle died under the bell as the wrong pressure tried the back door. Iris stood, hand on the western jamb, thumb in Marjorie's print, palm against brick. She did not speak. Not to the door, not to the old habit rising like reflux. She breathed through her nose until she tasted lime, and then butter, and then the ghost of lavender that the drawer had loaned the room. The wrong press lost its angle, slipped, and went outside to sulk. At the kiln, the figure came near at the wrong time. Panic, not performance. It did not grandstand. It moved like heat does when a door opens in the room it wants to occupy. Quick and ashamed of the speed. It reached the vent and put both of its knot hands to either side of the mouth, as if bracing the brick. It lifted its knot face, and for the first time since the town had learned not to ask too much of it, it said a word out loud. Not a name, not even a beautiful word. Home, it said, and because the mouth it used was a mouth built to move fire right, it sounded like an instruction rather than a plea. The draw pulled. The yard's air ducked into the kiln obediently, humble as smoke from casseroles and election days and shoes dried by the stove. The pressure that had been practicing on children's lips pivoted and found a throat that had been meant for it all along. Milk boiled over, and June laughed once, as if relieved to see a real mess. Ivy swore softly and expertly saved the pan. The bell cord around Iris's wrist twitched like a living thing, and then lay still. Across at the town hall, Vinegar and Rag and Foreman worked the sealer's vanity down to something breathable. Pearl took a picture solely so she could send it to the trust with a paragraph that would blister and heal. Reed stood under the east arch and became a hinge again, and sneezed because the body knows how to be useful in silly ways. The knot hands at the vent relaxed. The figure thinned and became nothing more than the motion of correct air toward correct exits. The kiln kept its old promise to turn appetite into labor. The yard smelled like saved milk and brick coming back from a mistake. "Good," Magda said, cheeks pink with effort and indignation and pride, leaning on the broom Ivy had left against a scaffold leg. "Learn home properly, then." She patted the brick with the side of her hand the way women pat the shoulders of men who have remembered their use. Ida, who had stayed near her grandmother because bells make good bracelets and because 7 is a better age for observation than for bravery, came forward with a solemnity children reserve for delivering a shared joke carefully. She set her small palm on the brick where the knot hands had been and then put it beside the foreman's thumbprint, carefully, off to the side where future work will not be offended. A faint damp mark, nothing so vulgar as soot, appeared and faded and left the sense of touch behind it. "Home," she said, through her nose as if that were the strangest trick a word had ever learned. "Home," Ira said, because some words are allowed to be shared if the door isn't listening. They tidied. The sealer's gloss dulled. The vinegar smell scampered away. The bells hung back where bells hang when a storm has apologized. The green lifted its shawl and forgot to point. The Airbnb wreath considered and declined rustling. The school boiler admitted to having admired the chaos and promised, in radiators, to behave. Ashdown sent the council home fed. Claire, whose eyes had the washed look of a woman who has learned a new category in an hour, shook Reed's hand and said, "We will put this in the brochure, but in the middle where nobody reads." Reed said, "Good," and meant it, and then apologized for meaning it out loud. That evening, Iris took Marjorie's letter to the Western Jam and read it to Brick in the private way doctrine fills certain rooms, for the benefit of the reader and the wall, not for a ghost. She said, "We are mixed," at the hearth, and the hearth warmed as if amused. She put her thumb in Marjorie's print and left nothing visible. She placed the iron hand in Lita's drawer and lingered over the snuffer and the corkscrew and needed to weep only a little. She tied the red thread to her wrist and to the chair and to the bell's cord because habit is the spine of sanity. She checked the jar on the sill. Crescents of soot from the first nights, a flat hand from a week later, a faint scatter of pearl from the town hall. She wrote on the label, "Sealer removed, home heard." At 2, she woke because bodies that have been useful stay on watch even after the watch has been stood down. She listened for the knock, long, short, 2, long, long, short, and did not hear it. She listened for the press at her lips and felt only the arrogance of a room behaving nicely. She went to the window and looked toward the green and the kiln, and in the watery light of the street lamp saw the faintest suggestion of shawl move from the green to the brickworks yard with the sheepishness of a friend who has been given a key and knows to use it. She opened the front door a crack, not an invitation. A courtesy to a room that had done its job. The bell under the lintel lifted and settled. The soot cross did not consider embroidery. Air came in as if it had read the sign and was prepared to abide by it. Morning brought blue you could trust. The masons knocked the scaffold with their knuckles and were pleased to find it reported back with the solidity of a good loaf. Pearl delivered a printout of Heritage bent protocol to the docent, who put it into a plastic sleeve with an absurdly dignified bow. Dr. Harrow wrote a paper with so little jargon it frightened him. Claire posted a photo of a pie tin on an iron hand and captioned it, "Local Maintenance," and was rewarded with 10 likes and no arguments. Ivy changed her window card to "You may call me Ivy," and left off the part about names at the counter, because people had learned. June offered to lead nose-breathing practice at school assembly, and Mr. Pruitt told him he should consider public office. Elsie cut her braid an inch shorter and refused to explain herself, as is her sacred right. Magda mended a bell cord and said, "Don't grow vain, little one," as if speaking to a child who had begun to believe she had invented gravity. Iris took Marjorie's letter to Pearl, then to Reed, then to Claire, and then brought it home and put it back under Lita's ledger, as if sliding a photograph back into an album with starched corners. She sat at the table with the kettle ticking its small liturgy and wrote one more line in neat, ugly print. We did not dig. We did not beg. We made a mouth where heat belonged. We fed it fat. We kept our names at table. We sneezed when we had to. We taught our doors, and they remembered. Later came and went. We live here. That night, the town chose ordinary. The knock did not come. It will, some other month, because nothing ends that ever had an honest use. Bells hung with clappers removed, and did the work of punctuation. The green held people, and then let them go without requiring payment. The kiln breathed. The vent read its sign, or we read it for it, and chose to believe it could learn. In the arch at the town hall, under the vinegar-cleaned joints, the foreman's thumbprint sat visible, as if to say repairs are not hideous. They are the only reason fabric lasts. In bed, Iris closed her mouth and breathed like a woman smelling bread, and let Ashdown use her chest a little to keep the air moving the correct way. Sleep took her as maintenance, not as reward. In her dream, Marjorie Vale put her hand on Iris's cheek hard enough to hurt and said, in the tone good teachers reserve for students they will love even if they prove difficult, no show. Do the job. And Iris laughed in her sleep and said, later, and even dreaming, she meant it as a promise kept, not a delay. Epilogue: Maintenance. Winter came down honest. Not the theatrical kind that frosts hedges for photographs, but the workmanlike cold that tests bricks and temper. The kiln at the brickworks wore its new sign without vanity. In clear weather it was only an aperture in old brick. In fog it was a mouth that knew its job. People arranged their days around what needed to breathe. Flues cracked, milk warmed, bells hung. The town practiced maintenance until the words ceased to sound like an apology and stood up like a trade. Iris stayed. She said she would for a season and forgot to choose otherwise. Lita's cottage learned her gait without complaint. The soot cross above the kitchen lintel, house eyebrow, kept its line. The iron hand lived in the drawer, palms seasoned the way a skillet remembers every meal that made it honest. On ember mornings, Iris set it on the stove and poured a little milk onto the palm because it pleased her to watch fat do something physics would recognize and doorways would respect. Marjorie's letter rested under Lita's ledger like a recipe under a receipt book. Iris read it aloud sometimes to the Western jam, not to conjure, to keep muscle memory like a dancer running scales. She pressed her thumb to Marjorie's old print and left nothing visible and felt better for having made the gesture anyway. When she slept, she dreamed more often of stoves and less often of thresholds. Spring unpicked the inversion. Rain hit the green with its usual small cruelties and larger favors. The council made a brochure no one read and a donation that bought Pearl a lockable cabinet for the archive and 3 new bells that looked like old bells and behaved beautifully. Claire learned the good trick of taking minutes with her mouth shut, and once, embarrassed at herself, hummed along at the kiln without needing to be invited. The docent added "Please hum" to his sign in bigger letters, braver each week. Children learned the town as a sequence of verbs. We breathe.
We tie.
We hang. We steam. We don't say names at certain doors. June Park built a little model of the kiln draw out of cardboard and stubbornness and made it pull incense smoke like a magician to show his class. Mr. Pruitt asked if he could borrow it for assemblies in perpetuity, and June, who had been practicing generosity, said yes and pretended not to care. Elsie Ketch cut her braid shorter and then shorter still and kept guard at the south gate of the kiln yard with her mouth closed and her gaze open. She wore her bell under her jacket on a cord of red thread and glared one visitor into remorse for calling the figure a spectacle, which is an unneighborly word. Later she wrote spectacle equals no in Pearl's 2 o'clock notebook with such ferocity the page puckered. Helena Wright knitted a sleeve for the pie tins so the handles would not scald the careless. She baked shortbread on Thursdays and called the crumbs education. Ida, 7 becoming 8, practiced nose breathing with the seriousness of a violinist tuning. She wore a child's bell bracelet that Magda had slipped into her pocket with old woman stealth. Ida would put her hand on the kiln's brick sometimes and say, "home," through her nose and make a face at herself for being sentimental, and then do it again, quieter. The figure learned boredom in public, which is a victory. Some days it did not rise at all. Some days it lifted in the corner of your vision and made the smallest bow toward the pie tins, and then thinned in a way you could pretend was chance. If it came to the green at 2, it behaved like a parishioner who has accepted the good folding chair in the back rather than elbowing to the front to be seen. If a door forgot its bell for an afternoon, neighbors noticed and made a joke of it as they tied a spare in place. "You've dropped your punctuation, allow me." The feast of later settled into itself without speeches. It happened when ember weather came mean, or when the river sulked, or when someone from away needed to understand the town without being allowed to ruin it by loving it wrong.
Bread.
Milk.
Bells.
Names told to plates and ears. People hummed. Someone always forgot and started to sing with words. Someone always reached and touched a wrist, a reminder like a good potholder. There were days it went poorly. Once, a council contractor came back with a different spray, and the wall went sleek again under the East Arch vinegar, and the foreman and 2 teenagers with strong wrists and correct opinions brought it back, muttering. Once, a real fire at the edge of the allotments made every door in town think, briefly, about becoming a mouth again, and Reed walked until he blistered and sneezed until he laughed, and the figure loitered in a shame that felt like heat without fuel. Once, a visitor stood in the kiln yard and asked the heir directly for a show. The heir, correctly insulted, ignored him, and Elsie took 10 pounds from his pocket at the bakery and converted it to buns for the school fete as penance. People left and returned, as people do in towns with stories that are livable instead of fatal. A boy who had sworn at 14 that he would be rid of bells forever came back at 20 with a degree and a softened mouth and asked Pearl if the archive needed a Saturday volunteer. A woman who had scoffed at red thread moved into the brick terrace under the ash and cried quietly when her new door remembered her without having to be taught. A mason's lad learned how to lay lime the way his grandfather had taught his father. With thumbprints nobody would sand away. The docents multiplied. Small children became experts. The sign at the kiln kept its grammar simple and was left unvandalized. Magda aged deliberately the way she did everything. She taught Ida and Elsie to tie knots that could be pulled with cold fingers and to pinch snuffers neatly. One March afternoon, she sat in Lita's kitchen with her hand on the iron palm while milk fussed and the kettle ticked 3 then 2 and said, "Listen," though there was nothing to hear except the room being correct. When she died, quiet, in a chair, threads still looped around her wrist to remind someone later. She had a bell under her lintel and a card on her door that read, "I am asleep. Knock with your nose." They did, going in and coming out. The town hummed through the service with their mouths closed because the human body will insist on letting grief out of where it must, and this way it didn't get any on the doors. Pearl kept records that read like recipes. Reed made a habit of carrying a spare bell in his coat because it pleased him to feel its weight when a meeting went foolish. Dr. Harrow produced a paper so free of jargon the college suspected him of falling in love. He had, but with instrument error and the smell of milk on warm iron. Ivy baked buns that smelled like school pudding and found that grief brought out people's best table manners if you fed it first. The foreman retired and left a tidy row of thumbprints that made the town hall look like it had been built by men who weren't afraid to admit their hands. The Airbnb wreath dried out and gave up on being clever. New houses learned fast because their owners were taught to put bells under lintels alongside meters. The laundromat stopped writing names and instead steamed hearts into the glass on Valentine's because Cass decided to risk showing off for love, and the heir, trained, understood a joke. And Iris, who had come back to bury Lita and had stayed to mind event, became Ashdown in the way a person becomes their place, by doing the job without costume. She kept Lita's ledger and Marjorie's letter under the same elastic and added a line once in a while that made Pearl roll her eyes and then copy it into the municipal record because common sense is contagious when expressed plainly. The kiln draws. The doors remember. The bells remind. Fat feeds. Bread is for mouths. Names are kept at table. If you forget, someone will hand you a string. Sometimes, in very fine weather, The figure could be seen at the edge of the kiln yard just after closing, when the docent had turned the lights off and the last crumb had surrendered to the blackbirds. It was not a threat. It looked like a shawl considering benches, the way old women consider whether to sit and watch a bit more of the world. It inclined toward the vent like a neighbor who's learned which window you prefer, and then it went thin as a good laugh and left nothing behind but a faint dampness on brick that any mason would tell you is ordinary. On the evening 1 year after home, Iris brought the iron hand to the yard and set it on the radiator, without ceremony. She poured the milk and watched a skin form and give itself up on the palm. June, older, taller, still full of the decencies he'd acquired young, sat on the plank and pretended he was too sophisticated to swing his heels, then did. Elsie settled at the south gate and glared at the idea of microphones as a prophylactic. Ida, 8 becoming 9, laid her palm where the foreman's thumbprint lived and said home again, softer, because sometimes a word grows bigger when you feed it less air. Tell them, Pearl said, handing Iris a stack of cards. Feast of later, maintenance and buns was printed at the top in a font that refused to apologize for itself. Iris walked along the yard and put one card in each palm, even the dusty ones, and thought about Marjorie's line "We are mixed," and felt grateful to be. She set a card on the kiln lip for the figure, in case it had learned to read. If it hadn't, the gesture still felt right. 2 o'clock came and didn't matter, for came and did. The draw pulled. The air behaved. The town did its breathing, noticeable only if you had learned to listen to kettles and bells and the quiet rightness of a door choosing not to show off. In the night, a wind shouldered the river and jostled chimney pots and made the scaffold on the council's newest folly hum in a tone likely to generate letters. Lita's kettle ticked 3, then 2, then 3 again because kettles have personalities. Iris woke and lay with her wrist tied to her cuff and the chair and felt, with the stupid animal of her body, the instinct to verify everything. Soot cross, bell cord, iron hand in the drawer, western jam. She padded to the kitchen, paused at the lintel, breathed through her nose, and felt the pleasant arrogance of a house that knows its work. Out on the green, the bronze women looked like women with aprons off at last. The figure, if it rose the way steam rises off milk when you thicken it on purpose, visible one moment, part of the room the next. At the brickworks, the vent breathed. The sign held its grammar. Somebody had tucked a daisy under the placard. Nobody claimed it. The town accepted it as adequate theology. Before dawn, when the sky is uncommitted and the birds are overdue, Iris sat at the table and added one more line to the ledger in her ugly, trustworthy print. If we have ghosts, they're taught chores. If we have saints, they bring bread. Later is a rule. Neighbor is the point. We live here. She put the pen down. Because nothing ends that has an honest use. The bells did their work and the milk hissed and the hands, human, remembered, imagined, found brick and heat and each other, and Ashdown stayed what it had become. A place that had built itself an ordinary mouth and taught the past to use it.